the Democrats are kind of freaking out. But they've known about this for a while and they haven't decided to make any changes. So they're going to have to go into this election with somebody in that position. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to be a close election here. It is going to be very close. It'll probably come down to about 5 states and truly about, I don't know, 250,000 people really that make the difference. So that independent swing voter or turning out your voters is very important. However, I would mention this. Only 83% of people who voted for Biden in 2020 said they would vote for him again in 2024. If that's the case, if that's true, then you are looking at a Trump landslide in November.
I'm joined now here on Times Radio by Dana Perino. She's a former White House press secretary to George W. Bush, and she's co-host of America's Newsroom and The Five on Fox News Channel, and also host of Perino on Politics, of the Perino on Politics podcast on Fox News Audio. Dana, a warm welcome to Times Radio. Thanks so much for being with us.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
I'm so keen to tap into your experience. You've been around, in and around US politics for such a long time. Can I get you, first of all, to put into context where you think the country is in terms of its politics? Does it follow a political cycle? How would you sum up where you are right now?
It's interesting. I think that every cycle is a little bit different. This one is particularly different because you have an incumbent president running for re-election, that's Joe Biden. And then you have former President Trump, who is almost like an incumbent in a way, right? And we haven't had this happen in, I think, almost 100 years, or maybe longer than that, where you had someone who lost try to run again. So that's unique and different. This is a moment where you have both candidates have 100% name ID. Everybody knows them. Everybody has an opinion about them. We are also at a time that I think is really interesting, that is the development of changing political coalitions. And I think you've had the same in the UK over time, where somebody who might have been a blue collar worker then switches over to maybe the other party. That takes a little bit of time. Certainly during the Reagan years, that happened to a lot of Democrats. There's not as many anymore, but they were called Reagan Democrats. These are people who had voted Democrat for generations, who decide that in the 80s, they're going to switch over and support Ronald Reagan. And that really became the fuel to George H.W. Bush's win, and even George W. Bush's win. And there's still a strain of that in the Republican Party for sure. But I do think on the Republican side of things, this is very much a Donald Trump party, maybe like 65-35 in terms of the makeup of that coalition. But that coalition has changed too, with more blue collar workers moving over to the Republican side. And when I was first starting in politics, Republicans always won college educated voters, no matter what. That has changed quite dramatically as well, because most of those voters now vote with the Democrats. And then on the Democratic side, you have President Biden with a very restless base. You have moderate Democrats who are kind of like in the Bill Clinton mode. And then you have more of a progressive left. And Biden has kind of agreed with the progressive left on most things, especially economically. A little bit of a resistance from him on what they want to see happen in Israel and Gaza, but that's even changing. And so for me, what's so interesting is living through a political transformation of the country. That's been fascinating. I think that you have also technology that's changing, and how people communicate is very different. I always think about how FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he figured out how to use the radio to great advantage. Then you had John F. Kennedy. He figured out then how to really make sure that television was used. Reagan then perfected that. Then you have probably Obama, and then certainly President Trump, use social media and new technology. I don't know what the future brings. I think we're all looking at artificial intelligence. I know your country is as well, and how this is going to change things. So all of those things combined together, on top of all the issues that we're dealing with here, I'll just mention the economy certainly being one of them, immigration, a big problem for us here in the United States, but crime as well as an issue. And then the overall concern about democracy, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, combines to make this cycle pretty interesting.
Is trust in politics, how would you rate that at the moment?
Mhm.
How much faith do people have in the American political system?
Well, uh, I mean, on the one hand, I would say not much. But then on the other hand, I think actually, when it comes down to it, like if you look at January 6th and the attempt to have the election taken away from Biden, like that didn't happen because the institutions held. And I think that that is true. But trust in institutions is way down, especially for example, the Department of Health and Human Services, or CDC, uh, when it comes to disease control. What happened with COVID, there's not a lot of trust there. The Supreme Court, which had been one of the highest rated in terms of trust, even that's down to about 60%. That's not good. And our military had always been way up high as well, and that's down as well. It's not to crisis levels yet. And certainly everybody needs to do a better job of thinking things through. And I think the way, again, that we get information and then the way we communicate is just a very interesting way. When I was White House press secretary, I didn't even have a Twitter account. It didn't exist. And so if you think of how much that has changed over time and how people can kind of get into a silo when it comes to how they get their information, that's also affecting the trust in institutions.
Sure. Look, we're talking to you the day before Super Tuesday. It's one of the biggest nights in the
Mhm.
American election year, probably the biggest night before the country goes to the polls in November. It sees presidential contests across 15 states and one territory.
Mhm.
Um, how did Super Tuesday come about? Why so many primaries in one day?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. And I wish my former colleague Karl Rove was here to tell you all of the history. I don't know how it came to be. I just know it's always been this way for me since I've been a part of it. We have states that go first. And part of the reason it happened is you had states that went first. So you could sort of kind of narrow down the process. So for example, this year is really, it's a big deal, but it's kind of a foregone conclusion. President Trump is going to win. Okay. So, but if you think 4 years ago when Joe Biden was running against several others, I think there were 4 or 5 people still left in that primary on Super Tuesday when the Democrats had their big contest and Trump was the incumbent. Um, what had happened was Biden lost the first 2 states, Iowa and New Hampshire, by a lot. He then wins the third state of South Carolina. So now then it's narrowed down a little bit. And now the choice is in front of the Democrats. Do you want to go with more of a left wing leaning person like a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren, 2 senators? Or do you want the senator from Delaware who's more of a moderate Democrat who said that he would just be old school? And remember, he also said he would be a transitional president. He would only run for one term. That was what he indicated. He ends up winning Super Tuesday. And so the Democrats made a choice. They said, we want to go with that guy, which is why I think some of them are a little bit disappointed this time because they really thought he was going to be a transitional president, one that would turn it over to the next generation. There's an article that will run this week in the New Yorker where he says he never once thought about not running. And I think a lot of Democrats are going to have their noses bent out of joint for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I was looking at a New York Times poll yesterday with
Yeah.
Siena College. The majority of 2020 Biden voters now say he's too old to be effective.
86% of
And
the country says
yeah.
that.
Yeah. So my question to you, I mean, that seems bonkers to me here in the UK. Surely, you have Joe Biden at the weekend confusing Gaza with Ukraine with aid drops.
Mhm.
Mistakes made by an older guy, fair enough. But when that guy's running the United States, it does lead me to ask
Mhm.
how it can carry on like this.
Well, a guy that I know, somebody I recommend reading, John Podhoretz. He writes at the New York Post, and he also writes at Commentary Magazine. He's the editor there, and a wonderful podcast they do every day, Commentaries podcast. He said, "How could this possibly go on? If you have 86% of likely voters saying Joe Biden is too old to run and he looks weak." To me, I think that that's why the Democrats are kind of freaking out, but they've known about this for a while and they haven't decided to make any changes. So they're going to have to go into this election with somebody in that position. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to be a close election here. is going to be very close. It'll probably come down to about 5 states and truly about, I don't know, 250,000 people really that make the difference. So that independent swing voter or turning out your voters is very important. However, I would mention this. Only 83% of people who voted for Biden in 2020 said they would vote for him again in 2024. If that's the case, if that's true, then you are looking at a Trump landslide in November.
Mm. You certainly are. Look, tell me what the Americans think of Super Tuesday. We've talked about perhaps the stakes being maybe not so high tomorrow because Trump will win it. What other important points can we take from the day? Is
Well,
there extra kind of are there extra
yeah.
things for us to learn from it as a sidebar really to what we're going to get on Donald Trump?
So I think one of the things I'm really paying attention to is just, again, the makeup of the coalitions and that transformation. So many Hispanic and Black voters are telling pollsters that they are not inclined to vote for Biden again, or they don't want to vote for Biden again, and that they are thinking of voting for President Trump. Now, I believe it was George W. Bush, the guy I worked for, won 45% of Hispanics in 2004. That number has gone down dramatically for most Republican presidents until President Trump kind of got a little bit better in 2020, but still not significantly better. If it is true that 47% of Hispanics now want to vote for President Trump, then again, you're looking at big transformational changes. So that's on the presidential side. I also think it's worth looking at a couple of things where in our state, in our system, we have, for example, 2 senators per state. And in California, our biggest, most populous state, there's a big Democratic primary happening. And Adam Schiff, who was a congressman who made himself pretty famous during the Trump years as being a Trump antagonist, he is trying to replace Senator Dianne Feinstein in that contest. So I think people are going to pay attention to that. And there are a few other primaries, for example, in Ohio, for that senatorial race to find out who is the Democratic or Republican candidate going to be in those contests, because for our congressional leadership, that really matters, or who has the majority.
Mhm.
Those majorities right now are so slim. I think it's like Republicans are up by 2 in the House and the Democrats are up by 1 in the Senate. Obviously, Republicans and Democrats would like to improve their margins in both of those houses. So that's something else we pay attention to.
Certainly. Look, I was reading a little about you earlier, and I have to.
Uh-oh.
We've been talking a lot about MP safety, um, you, you know, um, around our politics, how we've seen multiple protests.
Yeah.
There are protests against what's happening in Israel and Gaza. They are at odds with what we're hearing from our prime minister. There is an awful lot of division there, and it started to get heated. I was
Mhm.
looking back at your record here, and I was taken by the fact that you were hit by a microphone stand during a
Yeah.
scuffle that followed an
Yes.
arrested journalist. So just tell us about what happened here and what the message is. Is it just one of those things that can happen as someone,
Oh, no, it's very unusual. We were
Go
in
on.
Iraq, and it was a press conference that President Bush was doing with Prime Minister Maliki. And this is where he called himself a journalist. He was obviously a terrorist who stood up and threw shoes at the president. The president, being quite an athletic person, dodged them both very easily with quick reflexes. But when the shoes were thrown, the lead Secret Service agent lunged forward to protect the president, and he hit the steel arm of the boom mic, which swung around and caught me right under the eye on that bone there. And yeah, it hurt. And I ended up with a black eye for like the last 5 weeks of the
Gosh.
administration, which some might say was a metaphor. Um, but I was fine. Thankfully, it didn't break. It was a pretty hard blow, but I look back on that and I called it the black eye of Baghdad. I had it.
Are you worried, Dana, about division in politics? I mean, look, all of us are aware what happened after Joe Biden came into office,
Mhm.
and what happened with President Trump. He was and still is convinced that the election was rigged. He feels that there
Mhm.
was voter fraud. Obviously, we had the insurrection on Jan 6th as well. Do you worry about politics reaching that level of toxicity again, or do you think that that's happened, and because Donald Trump is so ahead in the polls at the moment, there is not much for him to kick back against. So it will be a kind of a milder campaign.
I think it's a very thoughtful question. And I would say instinctively, yeah, I'm worried on one level. But I just came back from a week off. I was in Key West, Florida, which is sort of a melting pot of all sorts of different people from America who are there to get some sun or people who live there full time. I highly recommend it. This place was fabulous, a real live and let live kind of place. And I was there for a week, and there's no political signs anywhere. Nobody brought up politics. If people recognized me, it was like, "Hey, Dana, how's it going? Good. How are you? Great." And nobody was agitated by it. And what I find is that I think this is probably true in the UK. And I only say that because I did get to live there for about a year and live in St.
You
Anne's with
did.
my husband. Um, that neighbor to neighbor in your community, there might be tension. And I'm not saying that there's not. I mean, especially I just did an interview this morning with a woman in Denver, Colorado, and the immigration issue is really pulling apart one of the suburbs there because this is a city that wants to take care of their own citizens, legal residents, and make sure that the rec centers stay open. And they're at verge of closing because they need the money to take care of migrants. And there's a lot of tension. But I still feel like people are holding together pretty well. I believe that in my heart and then a little bit more intellectually. However, I do think that there are times when I look at things and think, wow, this could be on a hair trigger. I'm grateful for all of the law enforcement that protects the people who sometimes don't act like they deserve the protection.
Dana, it's been so fascinating speaking to you. Have a great Super Tuesday. We're going to be at
Thank you. We're
Republicans
calling it
over
Super Duper Tuesday, so we
Super
hope it is
Duper
a good one.
Tuesday. We're broadcasting live from central London tomorrow at a Republicans overseas event. So we're going to
Oh,
fully
neat.
immerse ourselves. Yeah. We're doing an outside broadcast. We're so looking forward to it. And look, we are,
Thank you.
and continue to be fascinated by American politics on this show and on this station as well. So it's been a huge pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much.
Dana Perino, former White House press secretary to George W. Bush. And Dana is co-host of America's Newsroom and The Five on Fox News Channel and the host of the Perino on Politics podcast on Fox News Audio. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, Dana.